Well, General Walters, thank you again for participating in this great summit and for sharing your experiences and interesting insights. It's absolutely fantastic. Let's give him another round of applause. So I think that presentation set the perfect foundation for our first panel, which is entitled Russia and the Shifting Security Landscape of Eurasia. And it will be chaired by Roya Talibova. Roya is an assistant professor here at Vanderbilt University. Now, I'm personally very excited to hear the panelists' views on General Walters' presentation and to further discuss how current events will change the dynamic in Europe and what that means to the future of the current political, economic, and military constructs of the European Union and NATO. It will be great to hear from their perspective. What does the security landscape in Europe look like while the current conflict drags on and whenever it concludes? As General Walters alluded to, whatever a conclusion actually finally looks like. Additionally, what roles do we envision for the United States in those circumstances? And what about those of our other allies and strategic competitors? Also, is Russia a declining power? And if so, what does that mean for a nuclear-capable state and for the rest of the world? Roya, over to you and our panelists to help us answer these and many other questions. Please come up to the stage.
Thank you, Lieutenant General Moore and Chancellor Diermeier, for this opportunity. We have an excellent panel here today, and I look forward to a wide-ranging discussion on the Russia-Ukraine war and the shifting geopolitical landscape of Eurasia. Joining me here today, we have 5 fantastic experts. To my left immediately is Mr. Jonathan Darby, former Director of Operations for the National Security Agency, Ambassador Kristjan Prikk, the Estonian ambassador to the United States, Dr. Eugene Rumer, Director of the Russia and Eurasia program at the Carnegie Institute for International Peace, Lieutenant Colonel Kurt Sanger, Director of the Integrated Cybersecurity Partners, and Dr. Konstantin Sonin, the John Dewey Distinguished Service Professor at the University of Chicago. We're thrilled to have you all here. I would like to just start with the war in Ukraine. As you all know, we've already entered the second year of this conflict, a conflict that represents the largest war in Europe since the end of the Second World War, in terms of civilian and military casualties, in terms of the overall devastation, number of refugees and internally displaced people. So I want us to focus on the significance of this war for the general world order. Putin's war in Ukraine represents a serious challenge to the post-Cold War security order. The repercussions and the consequences of how this war ends will likely reverberate throughout the world for many years to come. And so we are already seeing historical shifting of alliances. So I want to start with you, Dr. Rumer. What does this war mean for Russia-EU and Russia-NATO relations moving forward?
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me here. I'll be very telegraphic, but I think we can forget about the post-Cold War security order. What we thought would be a long chapter in the history of Europe and the world really became a relatively brief interlude. So, this vision of Europe whole, free, at peace with itself and its neighbors, that's gone. That was gone probably in 2014. General Walters talked about this war starting 9 years ago, and really that's when it started, with the annexation of Crimea and the start of the undeclared war in eastern Ukraine. It's still an undeclared war, it just includes all of Ukraine now. But I think it's, pardon the cliche, but it's the return of history. Historically, the relationship between Russia and the rest of Europe has been one of, very tense, and it's been really about the control of the space, roughly speaking, between Moscow and Berlin. And I think we're back in that competition for Who will control this? As General Walters said, this is about values. I would say in terms of values, this is values of 1815 Congress of Vienna, when major powers decided to recarve the map of Europe according to their dynastic or geopolitical preferences, and the vision of the Charter of Paris of 1990 that really was the kind of expression of this vision of new peaceful Europe with a big war and, frankly, any war banished from the continent. So we're in this, I think, for a long, long time. It's the return to what I unfortunately see as the historical norm, with Russia on one side of the divide. The border is now moved. It's no longer the inner German border, but it runs much, much closer to the Russian heartland. And I would argue that future generations of Russian leaders, again, looking back at the history of Russia, will not settle for the status quo. Arguably, Putin has created his worst nightmare. He's turned Ukraine into the worst enemy of Russia, with now the focus of European security being in Ukraine. And on the one side of it, you have Kiev, you have Brussels, and you have Washington. On the other side of it is Moscow. And that's the long-term competition that I think, as General Walters said, we're really committed to sustain. Over.
Ambassador Prikk, I want you to chime in on this question of the Russia-NATO and Russia-EU relations. As the ambassador of Estonia, you're at the border that Dr. Rumer was mentioning. What does it feel to be in that part of the region, and what does that mean for the neighboring countries of Russia, that, you know, what Russia calls the its, you know, former Russian historic land, so to speak? What do their futures look like moving forward?
Thank you for the question, and thank you for the opportunity to be part of this conference today. As far as we can see, this conflict very clearly, and as actually General Walters and Mr. Rumer also alluded to, this war is very much about more than just Ukraine. As much as President Putin and his close inner circle may be obsessed about Ukraine, it's certainly about much wider issues. And this is also the reason why Estonia and many other countries in the region, and I would say actually pretty much the entire Europe, has responded as strongly as we have. We see that this actually carries quite existential possible second or third order effects also for us and many other countries, if for some reason Russia were to get what they want out of this. And only one kind of comment or addition to Mr. Rumer's comment. In the past, whenever Russia had these major conflicts or issues with other powers in Europe, what was very different then was that they also had strong allies in Europe who were actually on their side, supporting them one way or another, fighting on their side. And this is a very drastic change now, because they really don't have allies fighting on their side. Even as much attention as President Putin's and President Xi's relationship has received, certainly China has not been, at least thus far, not interested in becoming a direct party to this conflict.
Mr. Darby, General Walters mentioned the role of the U.S. intelligence community in the discovery of Russia's war plans. We now know that the U.S. intelligence community was very successful in predicting the invasion, but it seems like there was miscalculation about how the war would go on. 14, 15 months back, now that we look at it at the initial stages of the invasion, both the US administration and the intelligence community were publicly and quietly saying that the war will likely last only for a few weeks. But contrary to the expectations, the war did not lead to Russia's immediate and decisive victory. What did the US get wrong? Was there an element of luck, or did we underestimate Ukrainian resilience and overestimate Russia's military strength?
So I think the answer to that last question is yes to both. Let me back it up though earlier, talk a bit about the intel that led up, prior to the invasion. And it was a whole of intelligence community pulling together information. And I do recall in summer, fall 2021, when I saw the first intel about this is what Russia was planning to do, my initial reaction was, you got to be kidding me. This can't possibly be true. And then we started seeing more and more. And thus, and I really believe that because of the degree of intelligence sharing, not only with partners, in NATO and elsewhere, but with the public, that's why you saw such a unanimity of response after the invasion in terms of the levying of sanctions and so on. Now, in the months leading up, summer, fall, up to the invasion, there was a series of dialogues, interesting dialogues. U.S. intelligence community with foreign intelligence agencies saying, here's what we see, here's what we think. U.S. intelligence community discussion with U.S. policy making community. Here's what we see, here's what we think. Foreign intelligence agencies talking with their policy communities. And there was just this four-way, dialogue that was ongoing. And I recall in January of 2022, I was talking with the head of a foreign intelligence agency who said, we don't believe this is going to happen. That there's not enough combat power they have on the border. We had to explain, look, you can observe things, but what you've got with the intelligence being shared is intentions and what they intend to do. So I'd say the intelligence community, as you say, nailed that sucker. We knew what they were going to do, when they were going to do it, how they were going to do it. But we did miscalculate in a couple of things. Clearly, it's difficult from an intelligence perspective to anticipate the will to fight, for example. And frankly, I think most people thought President Zelensky would leave in the days and didn't anticipate him being such a resilient, inspirational wartime leader, to rally not only the troops, but the civilians across Ukraine. And I think on the Russia side, we were focused on combat power, and really they had overwhelming combat power to bring. What we didn't really get right was the capacity to use that power, the things like problems they have with command and control and logistics and morale and things like that. So measuring the will to fight and the capacity to fight, for the Ukraine and Russia side is an area that we had shortfalls, and that's recognized across the community. I know Director of National Intelligence, DNI Avril Haines, directed a study, last summer to really look at that. How does the intelligence community measure that? Will to fight, capacity to fight, maybe different methodologies and approaches to do better in the future.
That's great. I want to stay on this topic of miscalculation, and I want to turn to Dr. Konstantin Sonin. You are obviously an expert in Russia's domestic political and economic landscape. What did Russia get wrong? What were the fundamental weaknesses in Russia's war-making plans? Was it that they weren't expecting that the Ukrainians would fight or would have the capacity to fight, or that US would be too preoccupied or the Western countries would be too preoccupied to intervene? Or was it because of the lack of strong response to the 2014 annexation of Crimea that prompted them to think that there wouldn't be a strong united international reaction to this or a strong Ukrainian resilience? What do you think?
Okay, thank you for this question. I think we talk a lot about military failures or success of military intelligence. We talk about war crimes, but also I think important point is that this was a massive failure of political decision making in Russia, and it was actually so massive that I think a lot of outside observers, those who did not expect the war, they would not believe that such a big country could be, like the leadership could be in a such informational bubble of sorts. So the political decision to invade Ukraine was basically based on the following premises, like Ukraine does not have a stable government. They do not have stable system. Zelensky doesn't have popular support. Zelensky is a puppet of the United States, Nazis, Jewish oligarchs. They never made a consistent picture. How could you be both a puppet of the Nazis and Jewish oligarchs? But somehow it worked in their mind. They had this picture that Ukrainian troops do not have any will to fight and are incapable of fighting. They had the idea that Russian troops will be greeted as liberators, basically. And the thing is that it's not just me reading Putin's mind. They have like half of the Russian riot police slaughtered in the first weeks of invasion because they thought that that's what you send to Ukraine. You send riot police from all over Russia because they thought that that's what they are going to have. They will going to deal with peaceful protesters there. There will be protests, they will be beaten up like they beat protesters in Moscow and St. Petersburg, and that's it. And of course, all these riot police, half of them were slaughtered basically because they were not soldiers. They also had this idea that United States is too weak and divided to provide any support. And here, I mean, I did not talk. I was in Moscow spending a year and a half sabbatical. I had to live in the middle of the war. So I spoke to people like deputy foreign ministers, things like this. And the thing you would not believe, the American audience would not believe how skewed is their picture of the United States protests. Like they think that, for example, Black Lives Matter is extremely important thing in their thinking, is that this is something like civil war. Not like a civil war between Fox News and MSNBC, but just like a real civil war. I live in Hyde Park in Southside Chicago. We had some windows broken in one shop in my block, so I know how important this is. But it's not nearly a civil conflict, and they think that this is like something which is real and which is holding United States from involvement in other countries. The same thing about like Texas receding from the Union. They believe me when Putin and his advisors talk about this. They think about this as about a real process, not some performance by a local senator. That they think that this is something that affects the United States policy towards Ukraine and Russia. The same thing about Europe and European decadence. So the point is that all of these things that I just mentioned, they were easily refutable. I'm a little bit following Ukrainian politics. The thing is that President Zelensky was elected in 2019 with 73% of the vote over the incumbent president. Actually, Ukraine, over the last 30 years, had 6 presidential elections, and 4 incumbents lost elections. This is an extreme strength of the democratic system. You cannot have a more prominent example of a very strong democratic system. This system doesn't deliver economic growth to Ukraine, but it's a country of an extremely stable government system with extremely stable institutions. Then I'm wrapping up. Like the point about Ukrainian troops not capable of fighting. If you look at the map, I'm not a military person, but if you look at the map, then a lot of the front line close to the Donetsk city is basically in the same place where it was back 7 years ago. It's 2 miles from the Donetsk city borders. It's between Donetsk city and the airport, which is now completely destroyed. The thing is that this is a place where the Russian army was trying to move forward for 7 years and would not make like 200 meters of progress. So why they thought that these people, the current leadership of the Ukrainian army, that were all like local commanders in 2014, why Putin was thinking that they're not going to fight and they know how to fight, it's beyond me. I already talked about United States divisions, and an interesting thing, Putin has like his group of, I don't know, court academics, specialists on United States and Europe, and they basically produce what he wants to listen. But if you carefully read their materials, what they were producing, they were actually basically saying the same things as I would say if advising. Not in a straight way, but Putin had all the information needed not to make this crazy decision. But already in this informational bubble, he made. If you do not believe me, yesterday, his main advisor on security matters, the chief of the Russian Security Council, gave a huge interview to a major Russian newspaper. If you read it, Google Translate, you would think that Google Translate made a bad translation, because otherwise, like the main security advisor is totally bonkers. Okay.
So can I pick up on that point? The information bubble piece is really important from my perspective, that there's certainly a fear in Russia of speaking truth to power. And it may well be some of the close advisors of the papers, they really did lay it out. But we certainly did see reluctance to speak the truth about the capacity of the Russian army to fight to Putin, who is the ultimate decision maker. And if you recall, prior to the invasion, the chief of one of the intelligence services got publicly lambasted by Putin, and all the other people operating at that level, they didn't want to go through the same thing. So I just think there was a general attitude at the senior levels to be wary and not necessarily speak the full truth about the capacity for Russia to carry out the invasion.
Right, but this means that there is something wrong with the government structure, even if you have professionals and they're unable basically to give you professional advice.
Exactly.
In the economic sphere, this happened, basically the same thing happened.
Yep.
But I would, very shortly, I would argue that this is not just something wrong with the government structure, but this has run through the society for years and years. Speaking truth to power is not something that is valued. This is not something that is appreciated. And when you combine this with the historical experience that we're going to muddle through, however badly it starts, we're going to muddle through. We're going to just throw more people to the grinder, and we're going to muddle through. Then you get this cluster, what they have achieved.
Ambassador Prikk, we talked. So Dr. Sonin talked about the capabilities to fight, and I want to continue along those lines. The U.S. is clearly taking sides in this war, right? Since the start of the war, the U.S. has deployed over 20,000 additional troops to Eastern Europe, has provided air, land, maritime, space, and cyber capabilities, security assistance amassing to roughly $25 billion US. How critical has this assistance been to the trajectory of the war so far?
Thank you. Firstly, about the U.S. taking sides, and whereas the President of the United States has repeatedly stated, and for very understandable reasons, that one of his objectives is to avoid any direct conflict with Russia. It's also very absolutely not only understandable, but I would argue that this was the only option for the U.S. to maintain its credibility on the world arena, to react as strongly as the U.S. has done on the side of the victim of this conflict. After all, U.S. was also party to the Budapest memorandums. That was the document that convinced the Ukraine to give up its nuclear arsenal, just like Russia was also party to this Budapest memorandum. But can you imagine what had happened if the US had just sat on the sidelines and see a country in the heart of Europe being annihilated by another country sitting in the UN Security Council? Now, you asked about the US reinforcements to Europe. Firstly, short answer is that it has been very important and something that really mattered. Longer answer is that it's not only been the US that has reinforced the, let's say, European or NATO eastern flank, but for example, in the case of Estonia, we've also had the UK and France and Spain, for example, in the Spanish case, reinforcing our air defense. So it's been a multi-allied effort. But what this has allowed us to do is not only given us more comfort and let's say good night's sleep, but this also helped, and I would argue this was particularly critical in the early stage of this stage of the war that started last February. This allowed us and many other nations on the eastern flank to really lean in decisively to help Ukraine. In some cases, taking considerable but calculated military political risks. For example, Estonia has sent all of its artillery to Ukraine because Ukraine asked for these particular weapon systems. And we know that the best use that these pieces of artillery can get right now is on the battlefields in Ukraine. We wouldn't have been able to do it unless there's a strong message also from the allies that we are here and NATO's collective defense promise is very credible.
One of the main capabilities for this war has been, cyber capabilities from both sides. So I wanted to turn to Lieutenant Colonel Sanger. How can we assess Russia's cyber operations performance with regard to the Ukraine conflict? There's been a lot of speculation about this. What was the scale of impact, if any, of Russian operations in the invasion of Ukraine and since then?
Thank you, Roya, and thank you to the Chancellor and to General Moore for having me here today. So, thing to remember is, by different standards, the war did start 9 years ago, but it became an interesting military problem, a more interesting military problem 14 months ago. And so we're still very early in that phase of escalation. And if you compare it to the whole of the invasion since 2014, or you compare it to the military actions the United States has been involved in the past 20 years, we unfortunately may still be at the beginning. So there may be a lot of cyberspace operations yet to come based on the strategic situation. So far, there has been a lot of speculation regarding the cyberspace operations that have occurred and their effectiveness vis-a-vis Russia against Ukraine and others, NATO as well. Questions about the effectiveness of those operations, but also whether they are holding themselves back. And these are things, unfortunately, I've been outside the wire for a year now, so I don't have any special insight, but I would not be surprised if we ever see what the Russians were thinking over the past year. I wouldn't be surprised if they think their cyberspace operations are underperforming. And I also wouldn't be surprised if they are outperforming what they had forecasted or desired. And that's because the targets they've been interested in the last 14 years, they haven't had to target with cyberspace operations. Cyberspace operations are a great tool when you want to have a strategic impact outside of an armed conflict. They could have an impact inside an armed conflict. But you can't, if you are Russia right now, from a legal standpoint and probably from an operational standpoint, at this point, use the deadly and destructive weapons that Russia can use against Ukraine. The thing to remember also is that most cyberspace capabilities are bespoke tools that are expensive and difficult to develop. So if you are looking at a target and you have something you can attack it with, that you have multiple versions of, hundreds of munitions, or you've got one bespoke and complex cyberspace tool, you would use the tool that you have more of. They may be saving those tools for a day when they need to use them outside of armed conflict or with someone they're not having an armed conflict with, such as the NATO nations.
I think to add to this is you really got to factor in the Ukrainian cybersecurity posture and their ability to defend. Russia is continually attacking Ukraine from a cyber perspective. The Ukrainians have said 1,200 attacks just in first quarter alone of 23, and 4,500 last year. So they're still, you're talking a lot of attacks. Now, Ukraine has been building up their cybersecurity defenses over years. And in fact, they've done really smart things like move data centers outside of Ukraine to other countries so that an attack on within the borders of Ukraine is not going to affect those data centers that are elsewhere. They've got redundant communication system. They've raised the awareness of how to protect networks, over the last several years, which has been to great effect. And just speaking of the Russian capabilities, just like Kurt said, Russia is maturing. They're learning along the way, and we're seeing recently combined effects. And what I mean by that is there was for an example, a cyber attack on a Ukrainian power plant. And so the cyber response team goes to the power plant, and lo and behold, Russia fires a missile at the power plant. So that's kind of the combined effects, multi-domain, multiple aspects of warfare being brought to bear on a particular objective. And I expect we're going to see more and more of that from Russia. But really, the example to the rest of the world, frankly, is don't deprioritize cybersecurity. You've got to build up those defenses because somebody will go after you at some point. You've got to be prepared.
I want to address a question from the audience, and feel free to chime in. This morning, the Russian government made an unfounded claim that the US was behind the Ukrainian drone attack on the Kremlin aimed to assassinate Vladimir Putin. What would be the rationale or object behind this claim, and could it result in escalation of the conflict beyond Ukraine's borders?
I'll start with that. Clearly, Russia would like to, they are presenting this as a war, not just with Ukraine, but with the United States. And the U.S. has been very clear in terms of intelligence sharing. We're sharing intelligence for the battlefield in Ukraine, but there are restrictions. We are not sharing intelligence on the locations of senior Russian generals located in Ukraine. An attack there enabled by the U.S. could be seen in conflict with the strategic objective that General Walters talked about. We don't want to go to war with Russia. Another limitation: we are not sharing intelligence that will enable attacks in Russia by Ukraine. So it's very focused, to defend Ukraine and not to enable a war with Russia.
There's been discussions about this being a false flag, and there's a debate about whether it was a false flag or not, and so I want our experts to talk about that as well.
Well, I'm no expert on false flag operations, but that story that appeared in the Russian press and circulating widely just makes no sense whatsoever. Putin, his commanders don't need extra reasons to attack Ukraine. The very fact of Ukraine and its resistance to the Russian onslaught, I think, is enough for them to continue their murderous campaign. So that doesn't make any sense. If anything, I think for people of my generation, the video that circulated in the Russian media is reminiscent of 1987, I think, when a amateur Russian pilot, a German pilot, Matthias Rust, landed a small Cessna literally in Red Square, which was a humiliating moment for Russian air defenses, for the Russian military. which of course was followed by a significant purge of the, Soviet, not Russian, Soviet military leadership. So that story doesn't make sense to me as a false flag operation or as a pretext to, attack Ukraine more. I'm at a loss here. I don't know if others have views on that.
Real quick thought when I saw it this morning was they're trying to recruit more forces for their armed forces, and maybe this was a way to rally the troops, so to speak, by saying that their leader was endangered by the West. But speculation, but that was the immediate thought.
I'm dissenting here. I do not think that this was a false flag operation because, Russian military committed so many blunders that the fact that some private Ukrainian initiative, actually there are people who say that this was a private Ukrainian initiative or Russian anti-Putin movement doing this small thing just to show that there is no good air defense. It's not surprising. I would not be surprised if half of this air defense is stolen. But coming back to a question about the Russian government words, I think, again, sort of dissenting from the mainstream, is that this approach to interpret what the Russian officials say in the way we used to interpret like Soviet leaders speaking or Chinese leaders speaking is sort of wrong. So like one thing in which Putin brought more freedom to Russia is like total freedom of responsibility for their words. They basically, you've seen Russian officials and Putin himself telling things that are completely irresponsible, they're completely contradictory, they do not think much about this. You see the Putin spokesman coming to press without being prepared. So I'm not sure that we should pay much attention to what Putin and other officials say, only to what they actually do.
Dr. Rumer, can you reflect on the after effects of this war? For example, if Russia prevails in this conflict, what happens next? Or alternatively, if Russia is defeated, what does that mean for Russia as a country and for Putin as the leader of that country domestically?
Well, I don't think that either side in the foreseeable future can really achieve the decisive victory that they claim they want to achieve. Unfortunately for Ukraine, fortunately, however you see it, for sure. General Walters in his remarks spoke about this being a conflict of values, and that we in the West cannot lose this war. We are effectively co-belligerents in this war, fighting this war with Ukrainian hands, lives, but we are enabling Ukraine. So we cannot lose. But I would say that the unfortunate aspect of this is that Putin cannot lose either. There may be a pause in the fighting, but that's only a pause, not an end to the conflict, and I don't see a resolution to it. Putin, perhaps by the standard of CNN, is a man in his prime, in his early 70s, but he probably thinks that this is the final chapter of his presidency. He miscalculated badly. But he's not prepared to give up. And yes, the economy is not what it could be and so on, but he has vast resources at his disposal. He may not have allies in Europe, but he still can rely on support of China. And remarkably, to a large extent, India, which has become a massive buyer of Russian oil. I'd also point to the fact that even though Russia is, its reputation is hitting rock bottom in the West, it certainly is not hitting rock bottom in the rest, that is, in the global South. Of the 10 largest countries in the world, only one, the United States, has implemented sanctions against Russia. Plenty of other countries are happy to trade. Russia still has an economy, and unfortunately, when you compare it to Ukraine, Ukraine's economy has been destroyed. We have an eminent economist in our midst here, so I defer to Professor Sonin on this. But yeah, Russia has proven to be remarkably resilient in the face of sanctions. In addition to the vast resources that it has, it also has a team of capable economic experts, some of them trained in the West, the best institutions, the University of Chicago, MIT, and so on, and they've delivered for Putin, and they continue to do so. So I think Putin is all in, and he will stay in this fight for a long time. I don't see him losing.
So I'm interested in your opinion. So I agree, Putin's all in. He sees himself as the personification of Russia, you know, to right the great tragedy of the fall of the Soviet Union, and he's not going to back off. I'm curious your view about, so what if Putin has a heart attack while riding his horse out in the woods somewhere? Does his circle have that same degree of buy-in, or does that change the calculus?
Well, he will leave the stage someday. It's just a matter of time. But I do think that for the next generation of Russian leaders, a situation in which Ukraine has become the soft underbelly of Russia, really. You know, it will be well armed by NATO. It will have a battle-hardened military armed by the latest American and European weapons with vast experience on the battlefield. It will have, I mean, you could say that Putin is the godfather of the kind of united Ukrainian nation, because, you know, until 2014, Ukraine had a very divided domestic political scene with oligarchs, with regional differences, cultural differences, and so on. All that now has fallen away. So that is not a tolerable situation for, I would say, future generations of Russian leaders, whether they are part of the Putin immediate entourage and men in their 60s and 70s, as they are these days, or the princelings, or their children, literally and kind of generationally speaking. I think that's a conflict that kind of puts us back on the historical trajectory. I mean, imagine if, and now clearly the relationship between Russia and Europe is badly, badly broken. And I don't see it going back to anything resembling the kind of hopeful time from 1991 or 1989 until 2014. That's over. So imagine a situation, comparable, I guess, in a way, situation with Mexico, aligned or allied with China and Russia, being armed by China and Russia, hostile to the United States, and united on the platform of regaining the lost territory of Texas. Would that be a tolerable situation for the United States to have on its vast southern border? And that's what I think now, as a result of Putin's horrible blunder, criminal blunder, he has created on the southeastern border of Russia. There was no problem, security problem for Russia with Ukraine being what it was until 2014. NATO was a distant prospect. EU was a distant prospect. There was no chance of either one of those, admitting Ukraine anytime in the foreseeable future. There was a friendly, Russia-friendly part of Ukraine tied to Russia by economic and cultural ties. He's destroyed all that. And he's moved Europe that, by 2014, somebody will correct me, but by 2014, there was not a single American tank left on the European continent. NATO had become kind of a school for good manners for Eastern European military officers and officials. The idea of going to war with Russia was, off the table. That's now over. So,
Mr. Prikk, I think.
Just very briefly, and I absolutely do agree with pretty much everything that Dr. Rumer just said. However, as crazy as it may sound for anyone in the West, I do believe that considering the the grip that President Putin and his regime holds over the media, and through media the wider society in Russia. And considering the dynamics in the Russian society, I believe that if presented with a viable or let's say viable strategic dilemma, Putin would still be able to pull out of Ukraine and declare this as an operation that took a lot of resources and in blood and treasure, but still tell his people that they have achieved the aims, that the Nazis have been killed, Ukraine has been destroyed as it was, and the West has been taught a lesson. It's all about strategic dilemma. It's about whether he considers continuing the war in Ukraine as more risky for his own personal and his regime's well-being, or not continuing.
I hope you're right, and I hope I'm wrong.
But I do agree with your statement that he's all in regarding this whole thing, the conflict with the West. But in my scenario, he would pull back, build the fortress Russia, or continue to build it and be as hostile as he can as long as he lives.
Basically promote a narrative that they accomplish.
Declare victory, go home.
I agree with a lot of what was said here, but not with the conclusions. I understand that I will be like totally ridiculed at this forum like in 2 years, but I think that Putin his regime has like 2 years or maybe less to live. I mean, there will be Russia, there will be Russian imperialism, there will be a lot of things, but not Putin and his people. And I think a good analogy is World War I. Germany lost World War I without a single soldier on German soil, right? Russian Empire lost World War I, like the state completely destroyed, and everyone was destroyed. The whole elite was killed, but it lost the war with very few foreign troops on a tiny part of what was then Poland of the Russian Empire. So countries lose wars not because their armies are totally defeated, and I think there is all things in Russia today. People are not happy about the war. Most people in the elite they hate Putin. They fear, they hate, they are complacent, but nobody thinks highly of him. So I think he has all these things as Nicholas II had 100 years ago. Of course, Putin has a security apparatus 10 times larger, which gives him more time, but I do not think that he has any, I mean, he already lost and Russia already lost this war.
I want to shift gears a little bit. Dr. Rumer touched on a subject that I was going to venture upon next, the China's role in this conflict. Mr. Darby, I'll start with you. What are the consequences of this conflict for the US-China, Russia-China geopolitical and geoeconomic dynamics? China has so far been very cautious about intervening directly on Russia's behalf. Should we expect China to overtly assist Russia in the near future, or is there anything that you expect that the US could do to move China towards this decision?
Well, let's start with the China-Russia relationship. That, as you say, China's walking a tightrope and kind of talking out of both sides of their mouth. On the one hand, they say, defend territorial integrity and sovereignty, and that's, paramount worldwide, yet they refuse to condemn the invasion and provide, and they need partners. If they look from a strategic standpoint, one of the major strategic advantages that the United States has is the power of our partnerships around the world, the volume and the strength of those partnerships. In terms of pure numbers, China has nowhere near as many, and the depth of that partnership is nowhere near. So they need partners. They don't want to alienate Russia, but at the same time, they don't want to get into a quagmire. They're providing non-lethal aid, and Secretary of State mentioned recently about they're considering providing lethal aid and said, hey, that would have consequences for the U.S.-China relationship. So if they do provide lethal aid, they're not going to, I believe they won't do it publicly. They'll do it, undercover and, in a deniable way. But I wouldn't, I guess I wouldn't count out that they won't do it. It's just the way they do it will be more surreptitious. Now, in terms of the U.S.-China relationship, how Ukraine affects that, yeah, the lethal aid issue would, and I'm sorry, let me get back on the China-Russia thing. China's also, well, I guess it relates to the U.S.-China as well. China's paying very close attention to what's going on in there, what's working, what's not working, how is the West responding to the Ukrainian invasion. And as a result, they're taking steps to insulate their economy in case China does something, invading Taiwan, that would result in international sanctions against them. They're paying attention from a military standpoint. What are the supply chain issues Russia's hitting? And it'd be much more difficult to invade Taiwan than it is invading Ukraine. So all those things are kind of preparing China for the big strategic move that the U.S. is most concerned about, is the move into Taiwan.
Dr. Sanger, so we're talking about what could prompt China in terms of U.S. assistance. And so I want to go back into this from the legal perspective. Does supplying military equipment or performing and assisting with cyber operations make the U.S. a co-belligerent in this war? Can we say that U.S., from the legal standpoint, is a neutral party?
So it's important that you said legal standpoint, because obviously from the everyday use of the word neutrality, the United States has not been neutral. The better question, I think, is, or to frame it a little differently, has the United States violated a rule that it is obligated to follow by virtue of its international responsibilities to remain neutral? And has it taken any action, the separate topics, neutrality and belligerency, have they done anything to make themselves a belligerent in this conflict? There are arguments on both sides, and I note that you said that the United States is a co-belligerent. I think there is an argument to be made there that's largely a product of intelligence sharing and intelligence, how the Ukrainians have used that intelligence. And John Darby, you mentioned that there's certain types of intelligence that won't be shared with them, but they also probably, there are use restrictions we asked for if they use that intelligence in a certain way. That would be the way that we would become a co-belligerent, I think the most likely way. Russia may have non-legal reasons to not make that claim that there is a legal violation, may not be in their strategic interests to label the United States a belligerent. Separate issue, though. For cyberspace operations, it's an interesting problem because for most other types of activities that the United States and NATO have been involved in during the past 14 months, sending aid, sending weapons, there's a track record for that. And so there are legal precedents by which we can assess whether we are coming close to becoming a belligerent or violating our obligations of neutrality. For cyberspace operations, there are no such track record, partially because most of what we do is classified, and also because the domain is opaque. You can't see what happens, what goes on it. So a year ago at Cyber Command, one of the things we wanted to focus on was ensuring that we didn't do anything that would allow the Russians to make a plausible claim that we had become a belligerent. And that involved making careful assessments about targets, about timing, and about various features of our cyberspace operations. But there's also something we need to remember, both for the United States and any nation that might conduct cyberspace operations that would affect Ukraine or Russia, and that is there are other operations, despite the conflict absorbing their attention, there are other reasons why cyberspace operations may be occurring. I would think the next one would be the United States protection of its next major elections. Those operations are likely to continue, and the Russians may perceive an operation like that, the United States or other NATO nation, as tied to the Ukraine conflict, and that may be misinterpreted and a cause for them to choose to escalate.
I have a question that I'm going to couple with a question from the audience. I wanted to talk about the domestic view, for the view from within Russia. What has the public reaction been like, and what has been Kremlin's view of its own people with regards to war? What has been unfolding in front of our eyes is how an autocrat conducts a war, right? And the perils that come along with it in terms of not being transparent about casualties or forcefully mobilizing the youth. Do you think there will be some kind of internal reaction at any point in the future that can deter the regime from inside, or do you think the compliance will continue? And here's the question from the audience that's akin to this question. Eugene Rumer mentioned Putin is in the last chapter of his presidency. Are Russian demographics in a similar lost chapter with a growing lack of young people, specifically young men who can fight wars, preventing Russia from defending and expanding territory in the 21st century?
Okay, I probably could answer about the public opinion. It's extremely difficult to study public opinion in an authoritarian regime. So some sociologists still do surveys, but if one question in a survey is whether you support military operation or not support military operation, and actually it's a crime not to support military operation, it's not clear what's like the value of this survey. Judging by the number of arrests, and there are 20,000 people were arrested for protesting against the war, judging by the cases, and people now get in jail for not only reposts or retweets, but also for likes for Facebook posts arguing against the war. There are thousands of cases, there are hundreds of people who are incarcerated, people who oppose the war publicly get 25 years in jail. So I would say this is an indirect sign that there is not much of a support for the war. The same thing about volunteers. Like for the last 10 months, the Russian government basically offers the salaries 10 times higher than the average salary, and there is a very few people volunteering for this kind of money. So like imagine if the United States government would it would be like $300,000 to $500,000 per year to be volunteers, and you will see not people volunteering. So I would say this is a pretty strong sign that the war is not popular.
And the private military companies are having a hard time recruiting now as well.
Right. Even if they still have lavish financing, then more than 500,000 people. 500,000 people is the minimum estimate of people who left Russia last year. This is more than in any year in early 90s. So this is like a totally huge thing. And with the country in which you do not actually have like actual warfare in the country, have this number of refugees shows there's a huge strain in the population.
Well, this has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you for doing us the honor. And now I'll return the floor to Lieutenant General Moore. Thank you very much.